This time around, we're going back to the year of my birth to see what was going on in the world of Super Sentai. In fact, this is actually a special season as well because it was the first big anniversary of the Sentai franchise, celebrating 10 seasons since its inception. Although, technically speaking, it's the 12th season, but that's a whole complicated story that we're not going to go into here. Now, today we are headed for 1988, and at the time, the 10th iteration of Super Sentai, Choujyu Sentai Liveman. Or, I suppose, Liveman, technically, but my pronunciations are bad enough, so I'll be sticking with Liveman. And of course, there's no Power Rangers equivalent to compare this with, because this is before Power Rangers ever started. So, strictly speaking, with this season, we don't actually need to go into it as much detail as we would do in a normal comparison video. But I know that's what people like to see, so we'll be doing it anyway. The season starts on Academia, or Academy Island. It's an island with a multinational campus of students who are aiming to create a new in-orbit space centre. But immediately we have confrontation between 3 students who no longer want anything to do with the Space Centre and a group of students who are fully invested in the project. During a late-night experiment, 2 of them are able to develop protection suits, but immediately after, the 3 rebels, Sukigata, Senda and Omura, board a ship and fly away, killing those who are meant to now have protection, Takuji and Mari. We fast forward 2 years to the Academy's graduation, where the new crew for the Space Centre are being chosen. But as it's being launched, small fighter craft appear and down it before it ever leaves the Earth's atmosphere. The island is attacked, with just about everything being destroyed. Our 3 heroes-to-be, Yusuke, Joe and Megumi, survive but are confronted by their attackers, Sukigata, Senda and Omura. When they left, they swore loyalty to a Professor Bias, or Biasu. It's never going to sound quite right in a British accent. He of the Brain Army Vault. As such, they are now referred to as Doctors Kemp, Mazenda and Obula. They also have a few tricks up their sleeve, like literal finger guns and being able to transform into monsters. In fact, Mazenda is able to produce guns from all parts of her body. And I know what you're thinking. But no. But as it turns out, Yusuke, Joe and Megami also have changed in the last 2 years, and out of nowhere, transform into Red Falcon, Yellow Lion and Blue Dolphin. The Livemans. We had this problem with Jetman. I'm going with Livemans. And we get our first battle with the Putties du jour, the Jinmas. We also get our first look at a Zord, so to speak, with Landlion turning up and looking not a million miles away from the saber-toothed tiger in Power Rangers. And this is Liveman's thing. The Powers and Zords, again I know they're not Zords, but I'm going to stick with that name for ease, are all based on animals. So at this point we have the Landlion, the Aqua Dolphin, that is actually also able to come on land and, let's face it, looks a bit rubbish, and the Jet Falcon, which looks a lot like something out of Jetman. Except it too can go on land in kind of a walker formation. Bit of a whiff of Star Fox 2 about it. The 3 Liveman's main professor, Dr. Hoshi, also managed to survive the attack and tells them that they need to head for a secret base that he built underwater. He began to work on it after witnessing Takuji and Mari being killed, but before they can get there, a new villain, Gardenoid Gush, or Gash, appears and creates the Monster of the Week. But he's done away with pretty quickly thanks to the Triple Live Buster, or the Biomotion Blaster. I'm never quite sure what it's called. Although it doesn't appear to be a combination of their 3 individual weapons, it's more something that they're able to just conjure up. However, Gardenoid Gush revives him and makes him giant, requiring them to reach the base, where they're met by a moonwalking robot called Colon. Now, I hear it pronounced a few different ways, but Colon sounds right to me, so that's what I'll be going with. This is kind of our Alpha 5-like figure. She's an assistant that is able to control and launch certain features from the main base, but she becomes more and more versatile as we go on. She pulls some discs out of her boob, which are used to transform the Zords into live robo, which they're able to use to destroy the monster, yet again. But sadly it's too late for the Doctor, who passes away from his injuries. But from here we dive pretty deep into the series. They really don't do a good job of establishing everything. By episode 3 we're fully into the action of this season before we can fully appreciate who everyone is and why they are the way that they are. But basically, Dr. Obler transforms himself into a monster because he hates humanity and he pities his other two partners who can only temporarily shed their human forms. But then we get hit with a whole host of new machinery, again just out of nowhere. We already had their motorbikes just suddenly appearing and with no introduction, but now Colin is able to take the underwater base, or Grand Tortoise, and raise it up out of the water, launching Machine Buffalo, which doesn't look anything like a buffalo, and is in fact effectively the carrier Zord for the constituent parts of Live Robo. None of this is bad, of course, it's just massively rushed in this early stage. In episode 5, Takaji's younger brother approaches the Livemans about building a car that he and his brother had designed. Now, this isn't really that important as he only appears in this episode, but it is foreshadowing for something later in the series, and it also introduces a new vehicle, the Live Cougar. Episodes 11 and 12 introduce a fourth antagonist, Dr. Ashura. He's originally a gang leader who hates studying, but Professor Biasu transforms him into a super genius, even proving it with a game show against some of the world's best mathematicians and linguists, with the losers being instantly executed. Hello children! We finally get a bit of depth to the story in episode 16, when a monster feeds off the souls of dead students from the Science Academy, with them being brought back as ghost zombie vampires to steal people's life energy. It sounds a lot more horrific than it is, it's actually just playing off a classic Asian horror character called a Jiangshi, but the point is that love notes written by Yusuke start reappearing. While it doesn't come out and tell us right away who these letters were intended for, it's revealed that they were for Senda Ruisama, again apologies for the pronunciations, or as we would know her, Mazenda. But there was no burgeoning romance, she rejected him and intended to reject love entirely. However, we do get hints of her regretting becoming Mazenda, especially when a doppelganger brain beast is made from what remains of her heart. The doppelganger gets turned full monster and is destroyed, but Ashura notices a few tears shed by Mazenda when the last of her humanity dies. Interestingly though, rather than using it against her, he recovers a necklace that was given to her and returns it. Something similar happens with Dr. Obler. He creates a monster from himself that is designed to reject fun and only study, but once he gets a taste of playing and enjoying himself, he goes all in, suggesting that this is a reflection of Obler, or Omura's, childhood desire to play rather than study all the time. You have Senda's desire for love and Omura's desire for fun and friendship. In fact, in this episode Obler returns to his human form and a new antagonist joins the series. This is Gildos, who presents himself as an alien who wishes to be Biasu's new apprentice. In fact, he's billed as Obler's replacement, who is once again returned to his human form. He steals Gildos' sword and escapes back to his childhood home, locking himself away in a secret laboratory, but his attempts to make himself stronger don't work, so another copy is made in the form of a monster. It turns out that Omura was never on Biasu's list in the first place. He begged to be included and was brought in through pity. When his mother realises that it was her who created Obler in the first place, by always forcing him to study, she returns to his side and he disappears until much later in the series. Episode 22 introduces a weird new monster called Butchie, but he's actually not a monster and also claims to be an alien, who also joins Volt as an apprentice to Biasu. Things start to get a bit more interesting in episode 28, when Biasu unveils what was called the Giga Plan, which is a giant robot called Gigavolt. And to be fair, this is the first time Biasu has actually done anything to this point. But a new robot turns up, conveniently in the nick of time, and opens up a fissure in which Gigavolt falls in, and is temporarily defeated. The Livemans are then transported aboard this Bison liner by who we later learn is Takaji's brother, his other brother, Tetsuya. He's joined by his partner, Junichi, the younger brother of Mari, who pilots Sci-Fire, a rhino that is capable of going underground. When cleaning out the desks of their siblings, they found the plans to their respective mecha and built them to the specifications left behind. Initially, the Bison liner's core is destroyed, but they decide to use the core from the live Cougar, as it too was designed by Takaji, hence the foreshadowing. However, Kemp destroys it, so Colon puts herself at risk to power it back up again with her boob. Was Colon meant to be sexy? Because I feel like she wasn't, but she is. Once running again, the Bison liner and Sci-Fire can combine into the Live Boxer. While the Bison still struggles with power, the two brothers try to pilot Live Robo, but are unable to. However, a professor turns up, out of nowhere, and with convenient timing, to give them a new power unit. Which, by the way, I have no idea what language she's meant to be speaking, but it doesn't seem to be Japanese or English, but it's clearly been dubbed over from something. Also out of nowhere, Yusuke just manages to produce 2 new Liveman braces. I've got no idea where these are meant to have come from. I guess maybe Professor Dorothy brought them too. Who knows, but either way, the Black Bison and Green Psy, or basically Green Rhino, are added to the Liveman lineup. With the new power unit, Live Boxer and Live Robo are able to combine to form Super Live Robo and destroy Gigavolt. And side note, the Black Bison also has a double-ended lightsaber, like Darth Maul, it's just that he calls it the Bison Rod. Too easy. But even though there's essentially a new form of Megazord, they don't actually always use it. For example, Live Boxer is able to accommodate all 5 of them, and in fact the Bison and Psy alone can accommodate more than one live man. In episode 37, angry at his test scores against the other apprentices, because Brainvolt still operates like an academy for some reason, Kemp turns himself into a more powerful form, emerging from a clamshell like he's Venus. Which is ironic, given the show uses a modified version of Gustav Holst's Mars Bringer of War in just about every episode, often multiple times in an episode. In fact, for much of the season, you're scratching your head as to why the Volt characters are so bothered about their grades and points. It's all to do with Byasu needing a 1,000-point brain, but even though it's been mentioned a few times up until this point, we don't actually know what that means. And frankly, neither do the characters. Mazenda also powers herself up by continuing her body modifications to become more machine, and weapon I guess, than human. And then in episode 41, Obula, or I guess I should say Go, reappears but takes a while for his memories to return. Byasu orders him killed, but mainly because he regains his memories of Volt. He recalls seeing Byasu working on something in secret, and it's revealed that he used to be human. He has a secret brain room with 12 brain capsules, however one is missing. He then uses a monster to brainwash Tetsuya into blowing up the Grand Tortoise, but it doesn't work and he appears to start dying. You see, it's the brains that give him life, but as Gildos and Butchie begin to question whether he's as great as he claims, Gildos is destroyed and it's revealed that he's not an alien after all, he's a robot, even though he had no idea that he was. And the same is true with Butchie. Byasu created them and even implanted false memories and used them as pawns in order to raise the game of his formerly human apprentices. Butchie's guitar-playing companion, on the other hand, I have no idea, but regardless, by the end of the episode he's broken down from an internal crisis and is also destroyed. And soon after, Ashura is cast out from Volt as well, due to his poor grades. Confused by Byasu's plan, he uses a hacker monster to discover that to become a true genius, Byasu must gather 12,000-point brains, hence why all the capsules in the brain room have doctors' names on them, but one is left blank. At the end of the episode, Asher is turned back into Arashi, leaving just Kemp and Mazenda remaining at Vault. Well, them and the other 11 brains and jars. But realistically, every apprentice that has fallen during the course of this series was just there to encourage these original 2 anyway. But it does beg the question, if Byasu was human, what were the other 11 apprentices, or maybe even more, doing for him? They clearly haven't been sending monsters to Earth, otherwise Liveman would be the 12th generation, which, technically speaking, Liveman is the 12th generation of Sentai. So maybe every season before this was actually canon and the ultimate villain, off-screen, was Byasu, and secretly a villain from that show was actually one of his apprentices, but ended up as a brain in a jar. I mean, it's most likely a coincidence, but it makes you think. And to be fair, Butchie and Gildos had a point, but it's never really explained how the points work. Often it just seems like Byasu is making it up like Dumbledore. This concept is the weakest point of the show, as it's got 1,000,001 plot holes, so we'll just move on from here. As the battle intensifies, Arashi is killed in a suicide bombing that takes out a monster while protecting Go. Although it's mostly in vain because Gush turns up, does his Giga Phantom thing, and then walks away, leaving them to fight the monster again using Live Boxer. Just as Mazenda is about to achieve 1,000 points, Go turns up and informs her that Byasu intends to remove her brain. She doesn't believe it, and once she reaches the magic threshold, Gush actually does something for once and attempts to remove her brain from her body. In one final act, Go sacrifices himself to save her. Well, nearly. He somehow survives, but it's not required anyway because Mazenda finally becomes all machine, and so has no brain to steal. But there's no happy ending for her as she ends up falling off a cliff to her death. There's also an oddly Christian message to it too, with her repenting her sins and Go praying for her. As the last one standing, Kemp claims he is okay with Byasu taking his brain and is duly awarded with 1,000 points, for reasons. But something weird happens where his actual physical brain isn't taken, even though that seems to be the case for everyone else, and don't forget Gush turned up with a knife to extract Mazenda's. Or more, it does, but it doesn't. I don't know, it's weird, but Gush turns up with a device to remove it, but Kemp doesn't die, he just gets turned into another form of monster. With the 12th brain, the human race becomes a slave to Byasu, including the Livemans. Fortunately, Colon is not a human, she's a sexy robot, so she's unaffected. And by this point, I'm under no illusion that she's the best character in this show. And if you don't believe me, by the end of the video you'll be convinced. Kemp is made giant and she's left to fight him alone in Live Robo, but it turns out Red Falcon had already made it aboard the Vault base and stabs Byasu, reverting him back to his weakened and aged self. To set up the final episode, he steals Kemp's youth and transforms into young King Byasu. In the end, Kemp's brain betrays him, hearing Megami's words, and wants to return to being human. Not only that, but all the other brains are awakened too, realising that they're back on Earth and removing their power from Byasu, leaving him back in his older and weakened form once again. As they try to escape, Live Robo destroys the brain base, with Byasu and Gush inside, with Gush telling his leader that the explosions are merely fireworks to celebrate the success of his world domination. Now the strange thing is that Liveman is regarded as one of the stronger Sentai entries, and I can understand that. If you saw this in the 80s, you probably have a lot of nostalgia for it, and it is enjoyable. But whatever the case, I'm going to have a different opinion about this when watching any season in one long binge, rather than tuning in to the 80s over-the-air TV every week. That nostalgia and anticipation, and the experience that goes along with it, will be very strong with some people. It's just not there when you watch it in one solid block of episodes. But the reality is that it's actually pretty weak when it comes to the overarching storyline. That's not to say it's poorly written, in fact the writing is actually quite strong. Each episode is fine in its own right. everything looks pretty good too, and the characters, special effects and design are all well done. It's just that for at least half of the season, it's pretty shallow. It's not really until we get to the storyline with Tetsuya and Junichi that the series gets a little bit more bite to it. But at that point we're more or less 30 episodes in, and even then it just goes back to filler. So I guess with this series we could say it's more episodic than some of the Sentais that we've covered before. Maybe if we go back further than 1988 then my opinion will change, but compare this to something like Jetman in 1991 and it's night and day. I complained that the characters in that series weren't that likeable, but the series itself is very strong. Then again, it could just be that we recently covered Aber Ranger, and that was particularly intricate and complicated, so anything is going to seem simple in comparison. But realistically, there's only a dozen or so episodes out of the nearly 50 that really contribute to the wider story. Again, that's fine, it's just a strange change of pace, and honestly, in that sense at least, it resembles Power Rangers more than some of the Sentais that we've covered. Sometimes the show does cheap out on certain concepts though. For example, in episode 6 they create a monster that is able to go back in time, so they decide to travel back to the time of the dinosaurs and bring one into the future to destroy Tokyo. And I know what you're thinking. You're thinking that sounds awesome because they're going to do sort of a Godzilla-inspired episode, one that really pays homage to Sentai's Toku roots and gives us a Megazord vs Godzilla of sorts. But instead, we get this. I mean, they do eventually make him giant, but even then it's not what you'd hope, even with a teaser of what Megazord vs Godzilla might look like. And it's a shame because the concept of a monster manipulating time so that you're never quite able to fight him fairly is pretty good. And they also make another Time Machine episode later in the series, but this only really covers a self-contained love story for Joe. One thing I do appreciate is the use of the individual Zords, like dogfights that take place in both the air and underwater. However, as we get further into the series, the sequences where these Zords are called for from their storage places gets cut short. They just call for the Megazord form straight away, which again is fine, but it feels odd when they've gone to the effort of building up each individual Zord's abilities, and also it makes Colon seem less important as you cut out the sequences where she is deploying them. In short form, the story writing is good, and there's plenty of good messages for kids as well, like a young boy overcoming his fears to save the day, or learning the balance between work and play, but there's not a whole lot of character development, at least not for the Livemans, more so for the villains. In fact, of the Livemans, I'd say Colon is the most fleshed out. No pun intended. She's very much like a 6th Ranger, and in some ways is the most rounded. While she doesn't join the fight very often, she will occasionally turn up in the live Cougar and deploy certain weapons, and she can even manually pilot Machine Buffalo as well. Not only that, she can pilot the Zords too, including Live Robo and Live Boxer, even replacing Yusuke in the main pilot seat in the fight against Monster Kemp. And she even joins them to provide analysis on the Monster of the Week too. Colon is the best character in the show. Period. Although the Jinmas are actually quite interesting too, because although they are essentially just robot putty types, Mazenda is also able to transform them into what she calls dummy men that are able to disguise themselves as humans in order to carry out her bidding. There's even an episode where one of them gets affected by a poison gas, turning him to the side of good, and falls in love with Colon. And to be fair, she falls in love with him too, before he's brutally murdered of course. It is a Sentai after all. Hello children. Like a few of the series we've reviewed, I do like how they managed to, again, explain away the old cliche of why not just send all the monsters at once. Essentially, the 4 Doctors are all conducting research into monsters that they may be able to use to defeat the Livemans and take over the world, but they're often quite specific, so wouldn't necessarily work in tandem, and also each Doctor wants to outdo the other, especially when Ashura is introduced, so are unlikely to help each other out. They're too proud and want the approval of Professor Byasu. And to be fair, Byasu wants them to outdo each other too. Similarly, I think the reason that they don't just turn monsters giant straight away is because the giant forms are actually the ghosts of the dead monster, or something along those lines. Essentially, when the monster is defeated, Gush turns up and turns it into a Giga Phantom. Which, by the way, Gush is effectively useless. For 95% of the season, he just hangs around waiting to revive the defeated monsters and then walks away. He barely has any lines beyond announcing what he's doing, and it's only right at the very end that he becomes somewhat of a bodyguard to Byasu, and kind of a butler too, showing some affection in his final moments. Also, Obala is mocked when he returns to his feeble human form, but Mazenda and Kemp are pretty much humanoid for the entire series, something that he initially mocked them for. Although, I gotta think that with Liveman being sandwiched between Gremlins 1 and 2, there had to be some sort of Mogwai influence to Professor Kemp's monster form. I'm not actually sure whether it's really explained why each of the Liveman's powers are based on animals. The suits are part of a development project to create bodysuits that can survive in space, and the vehicles are Academy projects. So that all makes sense, but why exactly they're the animals that they are, I don't really know. And this is indicative of what I was talking about at the start of the season. They rush so much at the start, but then a good 35 episodes or so are just filler. Good filler, no doubt about that, but it leaves weird unanswered questions. It's kind of answered at the end, just quickly stating that it represents their love for the planet Earth and the creatures on it, but it's just kind of shoehorned in and it feels like an afterthought. Also, a bit of a weird one, but what is the obsession with bums? I mean, in the show, not in life generally, that I understand, but still, why? Doing these reviews messes with your mind a bit. For example, you become so used to concepts like monsters and interdimensional beings and villains from far-off galaxies, but throw in a classic-looking alien and UFO and all of a sudden you're thinking, oh now this is a bit too far-fetched. It's only when you take a second to remember that literally 30 seconds ago you were watching a team of aliens and androids create a monster out of a meteorite that you remember, oh yeah, that's not actually that weird. So, in the end, I did actually like the series, but the main problem is that there's some glaring issues with early character development that never really get resolved. A little more time spent on their individual personas in the early episodes would have made them much deeper and memorable characters, and as such make you care about them a bit more. And it's ironic, because they did actually do it with the Zords, even if that did fade away later in the series. And they also do it with the villains, but when it comes to the Livemans themselves, Colon has the most interesting character arc. And she's a robot. Although, okay, I'll contradict myself a little bit here, because while the villain stories are a little bit more interesting, there's no way of getting around it. The whole thing with the 1,000-point brain just does not make sense. I know we said we'd move on, but throughout the latter half of the season, they're all chasing their 1,000-point brain, but it's not really explained what that's meant to mean and why they would want it. They just keep striving to achieve it regardless. They never say what will happen when they achieve it, so when you get this twist about Byasu killing them to steal their brain, there's not a whole lot of sympathy because Byasu never lied to them. They were just following the instructions blindly, hoping something good would happen when they achieved their goal, but never questioned what that was. Which for 1,000-point geniuses is pretty stupid. And the reality of this lack of character development is, this could have stayed a 3-ranger team. The additional 2 rangers are a welcome addition to spice things up a bit, but honestly they don't add that much. They seem more like vessels for the introduction of the new Zords, and I guess also new toys. Once the Zords are delivered though, they don't really need to make them Livemans. To be fair, it was just shoehorned in anyway, with another professor who managed to survive just magically turning up with new Transformers. But they already had someone that could control them, Colon. Now, this isn't quite the end for Liveman. While there's no crossover with the next series, we do see them again, but it's more integrated into that series, and while I know that's meant to be a good one, it'll have to wait. So that'll do it for this deep dive, and until the next one, I'll see you all later.